Hey y'all, how's it going? Welcome to the channel. No talking, just Bigfoot stories. All right, here we go. This story is, this person leaves their name, but they didn't give me permission to use their name, so I'm not going to. But this is another story that I got back in February of last year. It's one of those files that got dumped in the wrong folder. And I'm getting through all those, and so if you haven't heard your story in, I don't know, almost a year, I've got it. I'm going to do it. Just hang tight. And this is a really good one. The woman writes, "My husband and I have been following you for some time now, and we love your videos. We are over-the-road truck drivers and often find ourselves in some fairly desolate areas, especially late at night. It was on one of those nights, on one of those roads, when I heard a story that you read that brought me to tears. I couldn't stop shaking and crying, remembering something that happened to me in my early 20s. When we finally got to our destination, I told my husband this story. He encouraged me to write to you. I've never told anyone outside of a few close friends about what happened nearly 20 years ago. We lived in upstate New York, about 10 minutes from Vermont and 15 minutes from Canada, nestled in the Adirondack Mountains. The spot that we were at was a small lake up on Lion Mountain. There's nothing up there except a few houses, but mostly hunting camps. I was married to my ex-husband at the time, and we had 2 children. We had gone up to a fishing spot my ex-father-in-law knew of, so my ex-husband and his father set up our gear, and I was sitting with the young children in the car. The spot on the bank where we fished was within a few steps of the car, so I eventually got out, leaving the children to sleep while we fished. It was a bright, sunny afternoon, birds and crickets chirping, and the fish were biting. It was very warm, and we were having a great time. Even the babies were sleeping sound in the car. We had been there for about an hour when suddenly I realized it was very quiet. The birds and the crickets had stopped chirping. Even the fish had stopped biting. We didn't think much of it at the time, and we were growing bored. My father-in-law suggested that we start a fire to cook some of the fish that we had caught. As my ex was getting ready to gather some firewood, I decided to check on the kids again. I walked a few steps up to the car up an easy hill. I felt compelled to go around the car to the passenger side. I don't know why. For some reason, I felt the need to put myself between the car and the road. I should mention that directly across the road was a dense forest that was actually the bottom of the mountain. You can't see through the underbrush. When I got to the back passenger side door of the car, a horrible smell hit me. It was like raw sewage mixed with wet dog mixed with rotting earth. I slowly turned around, looking everywhere to try to find where that smell was coming from. It was then that I looked directly across the road and I saw it. I don't know what it was exactly. All I can do is describe it. It was hairy with black hair. The head was cone-shaped, but its face was eerily human-like. The face was wrinkled and its brow were more pronounced than a normal human. I could see it from the chest up, and its chest and shoulders were massive. As I stood there looking at it, I realized it didn't have a neck. The chin was tucked down into its upper chest. From what I could see, the upper arms were bulging. The tree that it was standing next to was 20 feet tall at least. This thing stood halfway up that tree. I've never seen anything that tall or that big in my entire life. And it never moved, only stood there staring at me. A few times I thought I saw its eyes flick towards the car door that was open in my hand. I felt hypnotized by this thing. I couldn't move. What snapped me out of it was hearing one of the babies begin to cry. Suddenly I was terrified. I began to shake uncontrollably, and I dove into the car, slamming the door and locking it behind me. And then I began screaming for my husband and his father. They ran to the car and asked me over and over what was going on, and all I could do was scream at them to just get us out of here. They looked at one another, and then they looked at me and rushed around gathering our gear. I screamed at them to just leave it, but we had about $500 worth of fishing gear, and they refused to leave it behind. They did, however, leave all the fish that we had caught that day. I felt like an eternity, but finally everything was in the car, and my ex-father-in-law got the car running, and we flew out of there. I was hysterical all the way back to the small town that was at the base of the mountain. They kept asking me what I saw, and I couldn't get a single word to come out. For weeks after that, I kept dreaming about that thing staring at me. It's been many years since then, and I've never been back. I refuse to drive down that road. There's not enough money in the world to get me to ever go back there. I'm not sure what I saw that day, but I don't ever want to see it again. Hearing the stories from your listeners has given me an idea of what was staring at me all those years ago. I never felt threatened by it. It felt more like it was curious about us and what we were doing by the river. Even so, it terrified me. I was scared to death to write you about this, but after listening to your show and hearing that I'm not alone, my husband urged me to write in. Thank you for doing what you do. I can't tell you how thankful I am to hear that there's a platform out there for people who have had these experiences. I've racked my brain trying to figure out what it was and why it was there. Why did it just stare at me? Why did it keep looking at the car? It still creeps me out when I think about it. Anyhow, thank you again. Ma'am, that is a great story. You know, I never claim on this channel to be like a therapy channel for people to unload their horrifying stories to help them with, I don't know, PTSD or what like that. I'm not a psychologist. I would never claim to be a place for people. I know there's others out there that are doing that. At least they're talking about it. I hear them talking, but they talk about it a lot. But I just want you to know that's not what this channel is for. But if it helps to get that stuff off your chest, then that's great. And I'm glad that the memory of this was triggered by hearing a story that may have been similar to yours. And I don't think you're alone out there. I think there's many people who have seen strange things in the wilderness or, heck, last video in urban areas that they can't explain and that bother them for years. And they think back on it and they think, man, what if this had happened or this had happened? And we always play those things in our mind. But thank you for the story. I know you were scared to death. You had 2 babies in the car. Y'all just wanted to be out for a nice day of fishing. And, you know, this happens and you can't help it. You can't undo it. And I'm pretty sure it was a Bigfoot. You say you don't know what it was, but obviously it was, if it was 10 feet tall, 20 feet up a tree, half the size of that tree in its height, then it's more than likely a Bigfoot with a cone-shaped head and all that kind of stuff. What I'm beginning to see, or what I've seen over the last years, these things rarely hurt people. They're not malevolent creatures for the most part. I think there are some that'll hurt people, but for the most part, they don't really harass people that much, and they don't. But we do see them, and it is scary because we're not used to seeing those things. But I'm rambling on, and I tell you why, because I really appreciate this woman and what she said. And again, I'll say it again, this channel was not started to give people a platform to. I have to be honest. I cannot just blow smoke and tell you because something has naturally happened that was my plan all along, because it wasn't. I just love these stories and I love relating them. I ran out of stories that I had heard, or I've pretty much ran out of them. I've got a few more and I needed help. And I thought, well, I'll just offer this platform for people to send in their own stories, and I'll share that with people who are interested and might want to listen. And that's all this is. This is not some And I catch a lot of crap over that from some of the real turd commenters that people have got PTSD and you're reading this screwed up story. And look, these are stories people sent me. I'm sorry if you don't like it, and I'm sorry you may not believe it. And I'm going to tangle up with you in the comments if you accuse one of these writers of being a liar, because you don't know that. There are no experts in this field. It's crazy to get on here and cherry pick stories that you don't think are real. I mean, it's a cryptid. We don't know anything about these. And what I told one of those jerks in a comment the other day, one day we're going to find out what these things are. We're going to know, and there's going to be available scientific data. Maybe never, but we can't make any judgments on these things without that data. You cannot do that. And so until then, every story is believable to me. Now, not every one of them, but you know what I'm saying. Most of them that sound normal and are pretty consistent with the other stories we hear, those are pretty believable in my view. But you can't cherry pick what stories that you think are not true and then just rag that person out in the comments. That's rude. And I told the guy that he should be ashamed of doing that. He supposedly knows everything about Bigfoot. I don't know anything about Bigfoot, and neither does he in reality. Neither does he. Oh man, I'm on a rant here. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to get off on that. But some of these people just get, they just hack me off with all of their wealth of knowledge that they share with us and that kind of thing. And it's absurd. It's absurd to project an image that you're an expert in this field, because you're not. You're not. Heck, there are people who are experts on the great white shark, but we still don't know where they breed or where they give birth. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of feet of footage and tracked data. They tracking these great white sharks. They know where they go. They know their routes, and they travel several thousand miles a year, by the way. But we still don't know where these things breed or where they give birth or what their gestation period is. You can't capture one and keep it alive in a tank. No great white shark has ever been able to be kept alive in captivity. So we don't know those things. But here's Bigfoot, something we don't even have a verified picture of, and people know their breeding routines. People know the time of year that they give birth. It is the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. So how about we just enjoy the stories that people submit and we not be critical of that? Why did I go off on that? I might edit this out of the video, but at any rate, we're at 13 minutes and I'm going to shut up and move on to another story. How about that? All right. Here's another story I got back last October, I think. The writer her name is Terry, and she really did a good job writing this, and I appreciate her. She says, I never miss one of your videos, and I thank you for taking the time to tell the stories of all those who have had encounters with these animals. Well, thank you. I'm glad you watched the videos, Terry. It's great. I really appreciate it. Here are my stories if you would like to share them. When I was in the 9th grade, my mother told me the story of an incident that occurred when she was a young girl. At the time of the incident, my mother, her siblings, and my grandmother were living with one of my mother's aunts, I believe, near Nola, Arkansas. I'm guessing this incident would have occurred in the early 1930s, as my mother was born in 1923. They resided near a wooded area where my mom's uncle hunted regularly. She said her uncle had set out one moonlit night to coon hunt with his dog and later came back running inside the house breathlessly, telling them of a horrifying experience that had just happened to him. He said at one point while he was out, his dog suddenly stopped and was looking upwards towards a large tree branch that stretched across the path above them. When my uncle looked up, there on the branch stood a very large man covered in long, dark hair, looking angrily down at them. Terrified, he turned to run and didn't stop running until he reached the safety of the house. She recalled how frantic he was and kept looking out the windows to make sure the man hadn't followed him home. She also recalled that a few weeks later, her uncle's hair began to turn white. She supposed from the stress and fear he had experienced and continued to experience. For as long as they continued to live there, she never witnessed him going out to hunt again, even during the day. The dog also seemed to stay closer to the house as well. My mother's memory of this was elicited as a response to me coming home from school to tell her that our ninth grade science teacher had played a clip of the famous Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot film for our class that day. Now, I have a personal experience with what I imagine could only have been a Bigfoot many years later. It was in March of 1989, and a coworker and I were traveling in the early morning hours, headed towards home in North Texas on US 82-287, and had just skirted the town of Henrietta, Texas. My coworker was driving, and I was in the front passenger seat. I don't remember the time, but I do remember the sun was just coming up and it wasn't totally dark. As we were just about to clear the guardrail at the north end of the bridge over the Little Wichita River, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, turned my head to the right, and watched as this tall, dark creature covered in hair was running upright towards the highway. It appeared to me that our vehicle and this animal were going to collide. I instinctively slid toward the driver's side of the vehicle to attempt to protect myself as much as I could from the collision. Somehow it ran so fast that it managed to cross the highway ahead of us. He was obviously moving much faster than I thought. It crossed close enough in front of our vehicle that my coworker and I both saw it clearly. It disappeared on the left side of the highway and into the trees. We both screamed in unison, "What was that?" I can't begin to tell you how tall it was, as it happened so quickly and my mind was trying to rationalize what my eyes were seeing. I know it was much larger than a person. It ran on two legs as a human would and was nothing I had ever seen before. I was 32 years old at the time of this incident. I had spent a great deal of time in wooded areas, deer, turkey, and coyote hunting with my family members since I was a child. I've never personally witnessed anything like this creature before or since. I can only surmise it was a Sasquatch. Nothing else matches the description of what we saw that morning. Since my science teacher had shown my junior high class that clip of the Patterson-Gimlin film years before, I knew what a Sasquatch was, but I never imagined the possibility of a sighting in Texas. Now, years later, it seems they are quite common all over the United States. Yes, they are, Terry. I mean, there's reports from everywhere. I don't know of a state that there is not a report from, but I think your encounter is a classic. You know, you see the beast from the car. It's just really cool. I've said it before, but that's where I'd like to see one from my car. I don't want to walk up on one while I'm hunting like your uncle did. I know he's not. It's your mother's uncle. People hunt raccoons at night. You don't hunt them during the day. I guess you could. Some people do. Very few. But they usually hunt them at night because a raccoon's a nocturnal animal. You know, he's out there in the woods by himself with one dog, and he looks up with his torch, and he sees this thing standing on a branch above him. Man, that would scare me to death. That would make my hair turn white. I love those old stories from the early part of the 1900s. They're awesome. Anyway, Terry, this is a great set of stories. I really appreciate it. Thank you for sending it. You did a great job writing it. It was really good. Thanks. All right, here's another sort of creepy story. It kind of creeped me out when I read it. The writer doesn't want his name revealed. He puts a title on this story, and he says, "Don't Go in the Back 40." My father or I haven't shared this story with anyone, not even my mother or sister. One of my coworkers pointed me to your channel, and I thought this would be a great place to share my story. When I was younger, about 8 or 9 years old, my father had a lease in deep South Texas. It was a rather large piece of land, maybe about 1,000 acres. I learned the land quite well. at least the front 500 acres of it. I was always told to keep off the backside of the property because of mountain lions. My boundary was a hunting blind that we call the sendero. Past that spot was forbidden. I was riding around on my little four-wheeler and was feeling brave one day, and I decided to ride the overgrown roads on the backside of the property, and I went past the sendero blind. As I was riding the roads, I came across a hill I had always wanted to go up. It was the tallest point on the property, and I had to get up there. Reaching the top, I turned the four-wheeler off and looked out over the country. I was king of the hill. My father could see me up on the mountain from camp, and he was frantically calling over the walkie-talkie for me to get off the mountain and get back to camp. I knew I was in trouble. The brush was thick, and there was this eerie feeling in the area on the way down that just wasn't there when I had been driving in earlier. The roads were overgrown, and they corkscrewed through the dense brush. I wasn't moving fast. I rounded a corner, and up ahead in the middle of the road was a large, dark animal. It was low to the ground, and it was hunched over a deer kill. I had just come by this place in the road going up, and this thing wasn't there on the way in. I stopped 30 yards away from it. I stopped so quickly that my rifle came out of a janky rack I had thrown together on my four-wheeler. The noise of the bike and the rifle sliding across the ground got the creature's attention. The beast remained hunched over the deer and looked at me over its shoulder. It was huge. It had deep inset black eyes, long shaggy hair from head to toe. I sat there motionless looking at this thing. We stared at each other for what felt like a long time, but couldn't have been more than a few seconds. I was scared, and this creature knew it. I think it could sense my terror. And then it nodded at me and slowly stood up. It picked the deer up with one hand and cradled it under its arm, and it walked into the woods. I got off my four-wheeler, I picked up my rifle and got back on the ATV and drove off. When I got back to camp, I'm sure I was white as a sheet. My dad was there on the porch. He said, "That's why you don't need to go past the sendero." Before I could say anything, he stood up and he gave me a hug, and he told me not to tell anyone what I saw. Later in life, I suffered a terrible head injury, and I have forgotten a lot of my early years, but that day sticks with me. That's the end of the story. Brother, that is spooky. You say you were 8 or 9 coming down a mountain on one of these little toy four-wheelers, and you ran right up on a Bigfoot standing over a deer kill, and obviously he killed it while you were up on the mountain not far away. That's pretty cool. That's pretty scary, and I bet I wouldn't forget that either. But anyway, it's a great story, man. Thanks for sending it. I appreciate you. This is a good story. It's kind of scary. It's real scary, actually. And after I read it, I was like, whoa, this kid probably's dealt with some stuff through the years. And his name is Dan, and he writes, "I want to tell you about my encounter with a Sasquatch that happened in 1975. I was 12 years old when this happened, and I'm 55 years old now. I'm a retired police officer with over 30 years of law enforcement experience. I am currently an Orthodox Anglican priest. I am married, and I have 2 beautiful children. This encounter happened in July of 1975 in the mountains near San Bernardino County, California, just west of Big Bear, California. This was my first Boy Scout camp, and we spent a week at the camp. The area is heavily wooded forest area, and wild game is plentiful. We arrived at the camp a day earlier than the rest of the troops. When we went to check in with the camp ranger, we were told that we were the only people in the camp. The camp staff had gone to Big Bear to celebrate one of the staff members' birthdays, so we were alone. The camp ranger took us to our assigned campground, and we started setting up. The work went pretty quick, and soon we were finished. The campground was surrounded by pine trees and bushes. We did some exploring of the camp and then came back to our area and started to fix dinner. After that, we kicked back at the outdoor stove and started laughing and joking, telling stories like young men do. It was around midnight when we heard the first screams. It started out like a wolf howl, but it ended up like a man screaming. It stopped the crickets from chirping. It got extremely quiet, and our scoutmaster came out of his tent and asked where the screams were coming from. We all pointed to the south from our campground, and I estimated it was probably a quarter mile. That put a damper on things, and we all decided to go to bed, so we got into our sleeping bags and we went to sleep. It was about 1 a.m. when my buddy Kenny woke me up and said, "Dan, there's something moving around in the trees and bushes on the north side of the camp." I got up and looked to the area, and I could hear movement in the trees and bushes. Kenny said, "I'm going to go over there and shine my flashlight in there and see what it is." I told Kenny to be careful, and I watched him slowly creep up to the area. By this time, some of the other guys had woken up. Kenny crept over to the bushes and trees, and he stood up and opened a hole in the area and shined his flashlight in that area. And there it was. A Sasquatch was standing there looking at us. It was about 7 feet tall, with long brown hair except for the face and the palms of its hands. It had long arms that went down to almost its knees. There was a broad chest and not much of a neck under a head that came to a conical point like Patty in the Patterson-Gimlin film. There was no doubt that it was a male. Its eyes shined red like a rabbit's when flashlight beams hit the face. We all started yelling and screaming. It scared the crap out of us. Our scoutmaster Bob came running out of his tent, and he saw the creature too. The Sasquatch turned and started walking east away from our camp. It crossed a fire road next to our camp, and it walked up a steep wooded hill and then out of sight. Then we heard a scream, and it sounded like one of the other guys. We looked around and discovered one of our scouts, a boy named Glenn, was missing from the camp. We all began running up the hill in the direction of where the Sasquatch walked. We found Glenn laying on the ground next to a water pipe where we fill our canteens. Glenn had seen the creature come over the top of the hill and down the other side. Glenn was in shock and had peed his pants. The camp ranger called the sheriff's department and paramedics for Glenn. Glenn was taken to Big Bear for treatment of shock. The sheriff's deputies checked the area, and they found some large footprints that measured 18 inches long and 8 inches wide. Plaster casts were taken of the prints. We did not sleep well the rest of the trip. We called our parents from the camp ranger station, and we told them what happened. They didn't believe us until Bob talked to them and told them that we saw the creature as well. I never go into the woods alone. I've gone back into the woods, and I've heard the knocks and the whistling and the screams, but I'm always with someone, and I'm always armed. I carry a GPS rescue beacon and enough food and water as well. I'll never forget this encounter as long as I live. Dan, I bet you won't. I mean, you're 12 years old, and there's you and all your scout buddies open up a hole in the brush, and there's a Bigfoot standing there just looking at you. But I'm curious if I'm wondering if you guys kept in touch from all those years ago. Did anybody report this to? I know you reported it to the sheriff's department. They actually found tracks and made casts. I'm wondering if this is up on the, what's the name of that, BFRO website or whatever. This is a fascinating encounter. Several witnesses, total visual encounter. The Bigfoot was not aggressive. He ran up a hill, scared one kid to death. Not actually death, but scared him into shock. Man, it's just unreal. I know you'll never forget it. It's a great encounter story. Another one that's one of the lost emails that go back into one of my my bad folders. All right, I'm going to shut up about that. Y'all know about that. But anyway, Dan, it's just awesome encounter story. I really appreciate you, buddy. Thanks. Okay, that'll bring us to the end of this video. Thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. Can't tell you how much I appreciate it. We'll see you guys on the next video. Thanks.